Hi everyone, welcome to Clark Environmental's Fun with the Environment. Today we're going to talk about our intro to Haz. We have an expert and a longtime friend, and I won't go any farther than that, Karen MacPherson. Karen's both a EHS professional as well as a CHMM. And I want to thank Karen. We got socially. Okay, there we go. Socially, we're going to be cool. But the way I wanted to structure and set this up is, here at Clark Environmental, we get a lot of calls for Haz. What is it? How do you identify it? What's going on? And so what I wanted to do is bring Karen in. I've known her for a long time, and she is outstanding, especially with the CHMM and the EHS professional. She knows a lot about what we want to cover today. Now, I'll start off now by saying if we're going to do a lot, we're going to cover a lot. If you want to, we're going to keep this up from now till at least next April. And then we're going to go ahead, and if you have any questions, you want to go back with it, you can go back and look. It's on both Facebook, it's on YouTube, and it's on Clark Environmental. I talk a lot, Karen, and I apologize. You know me.
Oh, go right ahead.
You've known me forever. So let me start off by saying I know that Haz is a big field. If you look at the slide, you'll see it's like an iceberg. Haz is what you visibly see, and that visibility there is only what's on the surface, but down below it covers a lot more. And with that, I'll be quiet and I'll turn it over to Miss Karen.
Yes, good afternoon or morning, whenever you watch this podcast. But yeah, there's a lot of hidden issues with the hazardous waste regulations, and not only that, but it's different in various states, depending on what state is actually regulating or handling hazardous waste by generators, facilities that accept the waste. But one important thing is that hazardous waste, one thing you have to do is you have to figure out, whether or not you have an hazardous material very often. But there's a lot of sources and a lot of government agencies that regulate hazardous materials. Department of Transportation, for instance. The regulations are found under 49 Code of Federal Regulations, under the OSHA standards, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, 29 CFR, and of course, our infamous EPA. Now in Florida, well, that is found under 40 CFR, but in Florida, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection has authorization for the hazardous waste program and the regulations to enforce them in compliance. Also, what is very important is the International Fire and Building Codes also regulate hazardous materials. DOT directs us on how to properly package, identify, and label hazardous materials and waste when they're at your facility and in transit.
Let me ask.
In a sense, OSHA actually regulates the proper packaging, handling, where it's stored, how it's stored, the types, and all this. Yes?
Let me throw in that drivers. This is for you all. Once you accept it, you need to know rules and regs too of proper packaging, manifesting, etc. Driver, once you accept it, it's now on your head. Okay, so if you leave that site and there's something wrong, you are now responsible. It's responsibility of the generator to make sure all the paperwork and everything is correct. But once you've accepted that material as a driver, then it's up to you.
That is correct. And a lot of things that are found on shipping and transporting, that information is very helpful in us determining whether we have hazardous waste as well. So a lot of these regulations cross over and overlap. OSHA regulations tell us how to protect ourselves in the workplace from hazardous materials. EPA tells us how to protect our environment.
Let me ask, this is something that we need to find out. Before we even get to a hazardous waste, we need to know what is a solid waste, because in order for it to be hazardous, it has to be a solid waste first.
That is correct.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, we want to define solid waste. But first, before we even say anything about solid waste, we want to talk about the fact that anytime you have anything to handle, you don't want it anymore, not necessarily that it's no longer intended for use. You could possibly recycle it, reuse it. Very often chemicals are found that are off-spec. It may be off-spec for the shipper to the the consignee that actually accepts the product, but they don't want it because it's not specific for their process, and they have to reject it. Well, you can always find other ways of recycling, reusing. Some people buy it because they may need less of a standard for that chemical for their process. So what we want to do is make sure that we determine before we even designate it as a waste whether or not we can beneficially reuse, recycle this material that's been generated from our processes prior to determining whether it's a waste or not. So the definition of a solid waste, though, is any garbage, refuse, sludge that is discarded or intended to be discarded, no longer intended for use, resulting from industrial, municipal, mining, agricultural, all types of different industries. But one important thing about the solid waste definition is that it doesn't necessarily mean solid.
Oh, okay.
It can be a solid, liquid, gases, or semi-solids. And noteworthy is it can be hazardous or non-hazardous waste, even if you had a hazardous material to begin with, and come from a lot of different regulated sources.
Solid waste doesn't have to necessarily be solid.
Correct.
Okay.
Nor does
That's the
hazardous
takeaway.
material necessarily have to be a hazardous waste.
In case anybody didn't notice, we have a
Little visitor here.
We're dog friendly.
Okay.
Let's go on. Can you sit? Or can you leave? What are you going to do? Sit? Okay. Should we cut this part out?
No, we're good.
Okay.
We're good.
Gosh, now she finally sits.
I have dog too.
Okay, so let's get on with a solid waste. It has to be a solid waste first. Then it's a hazardous waste. What can you tell us about a hazardous waste? How do we define it? What's the knowledge? I mean, what do we do?
Okay. Well, what is a hazardous waste? The definition of hazardous waste is found in, as you know, the Hazardous Waste Regulations, 40 Code of Federal Regulations in section 261.3. Now, recently in the last year or so, they've been moving a lot of these original sections and parts of regulations.
Callie's being very friendly,
likes my
everybody.
feet.
This is Callie, our German Shepherd.
Anyway, so they've moved some of these parts around in the last year or so. So if you've got older versions of the regulations, you want to make sure you have the current versions, because you will find that the regulations are now just a little easier to use as well. Anyway, so we have a solid waste. Is it a hazardous waste? If it is, the only way it's a hazardous waste is it's not exempted or excluded. Now, those exempted or excluded comes into play when we talked about if you recycle it. It could be exempted or it could be excluded by regulations just because of different reasons of handling large quantities of waste, where they decided petroleum contaminated soils. They decided, well, if it's treated in a certain way, it'll be excluded, so it won't be classified as hazardous waste in the regulations. And or it meets the criteria for listed, characteristic, or both, which we'll talk about later. And the thing about it is, in EPA Regulations 261.2 part, it requires that a hazardous waste determination be made on any solid waste which is generated at your facility.
And the
or
generator does that?
remotely.
Generator makes that
Correct.
determination?
The
Okay.
generator makes that determination, and in assistance sometimes with consultants that do waste profiling for the generator to help them make those determinations
Okay.
as an agent.
One of the things, let me let everybody know that here with we thermal treat, benzene, for example, at 0.5 mgl is a hazardous waste. But since we're bringing in gasoline contaminated soil with benzene, we don't have to be a hazardous waste facility because we're burning the benzene out and making a recyclable product. So we do have the exemption for benzene there.
For treatment.
That's one of the small things that I do know. So
And the source that it came from was under the storage tank regulations.
Exactly.
Yes.
You had mentioned characteristic and listed. Let me ask you about listed waste. When you make a hazardous waste determination, you list what are listed wastes.
Well, I want to get into that. But one thing we need to talk about first is we need to determine in that hazardous waste determination our process knowledge.
Okay.
Determining whether we have a listed or not. First, we go through, it provides a use for us to use process knowledge instead of having to test it. So, in order to do that, we want to look at the process where we generate this solid waste, liquid or whatever.
Okay.
What's our process? What went in? Just basically like a recipe. What went into that container from the beginning, whether it was a spill response, what did you do to that product, how did you potentially change it? But you can use process knowledge sometimes without testing, depending on the ultimate treatment and or disposal facility that receives it. But you use a safety data sheet, formerly known as the MSDSs or material safety data sheets, to find out chemical constituents that may be a concern that you need to look for. Bill of lading that the product came in on also has additional information that sometimes is not revealed in a safety data sheet. Additional resources. Some people are not familiar that manufacturers put out a separate technical data sheet about the chemical that also discloses additional information about maybe some hidden contaminants that you may want to test for, which can narrow down what analysis costs you would incur. But this all will be it's there to do the process knowledge for the identification of potential contaminants.
With these listed wastes that you have, I hear these letters thrown out, F, U's, P's, K's. Can you explain that in a little bit more detail?
Yes, I can. We talked about the safety data sheet. Here's an example of that. One thing to note is in recent years, all safety data sheets should look the same now, in part. They're formatted the same with different sections, which you can look up, and if we could zoom in on one of these, but we're not here, you could find a particular chemical, say acetone, for example. We're going to go with acetone, and it would tell you in the safety data sheet was formed, all the formats now are through the global harmonization system. So they have what they call pictograms, which you can kind of see on the second page on this slide, that gives you an idea of some of the characteristics of that particular chemical to help for the information. But there's a lot of information that can be contained in an SDS sheet that will assist with your process knowledge to get to this point of determining whether or not you have a listed hazardous waste.
Oh, there's some of the listed ones right there.
These are solid waste classes. You know, what you want. This is just a good picture overview that can help you see that you're either hazardous or you're non-hazardous. Okay? Here's your listed list, and these are lists that EPA put together. Okay? That they're very different in the reasons for these lists. But if you have it on your SDS sheet and you find a chemical on one of those lists, then your waste is going to be considered a hazardous waste listed waste.
Okay.
Okay? Then you can also have a characteristic waste at the same time. And we'll discuss all the 4 different characteristics, which includes ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. But then, depending on the state you're in, very often, and I guess we could bring this up now, is you could have a non-hazardous waste or a non-biohazardous waste, but COVID-19 debris from cleanup and decontamination could be a special waste in some states.
Gotcha.
So then you'll have non-hazardous or industrial waste. They're not really hazardous waste, but you still have some special requirements for handling that material.
Gotcha.
Just like your petroleum contaminated soils.
Mm-hmm.
They still have regulations on this, but there are several different categories of hazardous and non-hazardous. But to go to this, you must first make a hazardous waste determination. It's kind of like a decision tree. It's a step-by-step approach. First, you go to find out if it's on the list. Then, you determine whether it's characteristic or the waste could be both.
That handles as far as the listed. what about characteristics now? That's another whole ballgame.
Okay, once you find out that none of my, I've determined, I'm in the process, I don't have a listed waste.
Okay.
But that doesn't end everything. We need to determine now whether it's characteristic. A solid waste may be characteristic hazardous waste in one of 4 ways.
Okay.
Is it ignitability? Is it ignitable waste? We'll talk about it. Notice my friends and icons on there or whatever.
The
labels.
easiest way to remember it is look at those icons up there. They
It
will
helps
help you out.
Waste code D001.
Okay.
So ICR you can see from top to bottom and then the T at the bottom. That'll help you to remember. I for ignitability, C for corrosivity, R for reactivity, rah, T for toxicity. The first 3 only have 1 waste code. But the 4th one, toxic waste, falls into several different potential toxic contaminants.
Okay.
And they list them from D004 to D043. A waste exhibits the characteristic ignitability over several things, and a lot of people don't consider all these things when making their determination. Everyone remembers, most of the time, one main point is it has to be a liquid. Solids are not ever ignitable waste. Solid waste.
That's where somebody comes up to me and says, hey, I got one that's a flash point less than 140, but I spilled it on the ground.
Right.
Now I spilled it on the ground, it's no longer liquid, so then
it no longer has to pass the test. It doesn't meet the definition.
So if it's a liquid and it has a flash of under 140, it's a D001. If it spills on the ground, and don't do it on purpose, but if it spills on the ground
and mixes with the soil, based on the definition of ignitability, it would not meet the ignitability characteristic.
Gotcha.
However, say it's a non-liquid, can ignite at standard temperature and pressure through friction, moisture absorption, or spontaneous chemical changes, and that burns vigorously and persistently after ignition.
Yeah.
That's the second one. Now we're going to go to the 3rd and 4th. Is it an ignitable compressed gas? Now we're into that other state. Compressed gas could meet the definition of ignitable. Or if it's a strong oxidizer. What's interesting about oxidizers is DOT has hazard classes, 5.1, 5.2. They have specific DOT shipping descriptions for shipping materials, and they may require additional analysis through DOT classifications depending on the material, that in light of also determining whether you have an ignitable hazardous waste, you need to be careful about oxidizers. But basically an oxidizer is things like inorganic peroxides, chlorates, nitrates, but only liquids with a flash point less than 140 degrees make up most of the ignitable waste.
Next would be a what? D002?
D002, corrosivity. Well, a solid waste, remember we have to start with that first, exhibits the characteristic if it is aqueous or a liquid.
Here we go, liquid again.
But they also use the term aqueous. So you could have a slurry that would still be considered a liquid depending on its moisture content.
Got it.
Okay, so, but it would exhibit a pH of less than or equal to 2 or greater than equal to 12.5. Now most people, a lot of people understand pH, maybe when you're testing your pool for pH. Less than 2 is considered an acid, and greater than 12.25 is considered a base, or is basic in nature. Or if the liquid actually corrodes steel. Under a certain method, most people don't even use this or test this, at 1/4 of an inch per year. As measured by, you've got different methods for measuring these things. An example of that, ferric chloride very often has a pH of between, sometimes maybe even 2.5 and 4. But
It will corrode steel?
it will corrode steel, and ferric chloride is a good example that you would still have to classify it as a corrosive waste.
Gotcha.
But the most common corrosive wastes are the solids less than or equal to 2 and greater than or equal to 12.5. But no noteworthy information here. A waste that is not a liquid, when it is mixed with a 1-to-1 ratio of water, and the pH is measured to be less than the 2 and greater than 12.5, it is also corrosive, and it may require special state disposal considerations.
Let me throw this in. Don't take an acid and mix it with a base, try to get a neutral pH.
That's exothermic.
Because you're going to get heat, you're going to get a boom boom, you'll have a problem. Trust me. Go ahead.
Not a good thing. And yes, one thing about acid and bases is, the proper people that know how to handle it, to neutralize, or at a generator facility, you may not have to have a permit to neutralize a particular waste. You are allowed in mobile treatment units to actually neutralize, to change the pH of the material, but you have to know the proper handling and how to do that so that you don't cause a problem.
Gotcha.
And there's all types of strong and weak acids or bases that are best for whatever you're trying to neutralize.
That's the D002s. What else you got?
Let's see. The third one, reactivity, the R. That's under D003. Well, one thing about this one, it's going to go through 2 slides. We've got 8 different ways that something can be reactive. Let's just list them quickly. Normally unstable and rarely undergoes violent change without detonating. If it reacts with water.
Gotcha.
If it forms an explosive mixture with water. Or it produces toxic gases, vapors, fumes sufficient to present a dangerous condition to the health and environment when mixed with water. Again, but there's 4 more. Is it a cyanide or sulfur-bearing waste producing toxic gas, vapors, or fumes when exposed to pH conditions between 2 and 12.5?
You got it.
So now we're on the outside with corrosivity, we're on the inside between the 2 in quantities that present a dangerous condition. It undergoes detonation or explode if subjected to heat or initiating source. It can detonate or have explosive reaction or decomposition at standard temperature and pressure. Is an explosive defined by, it's not 40, it's 49 CFR 173.54. That is a DOT determination. So DOT comes into play here in determining whether you have a hazardous waste or not. One example, we could talk about on the reactor side, a lot of people have been handling, and we're not going into that today, universal waste, batteries. Be very careful when shipping batteries. They can spontaneously have problems if they're not grounded properly in the transport vehicle and cause truck fires. This has happened often, even during shipment in intermodal transport. Aerosol cans themselves are a hazardous waste. Even if you've exhausted it, sprayed it out, you don't think there's anything else in there, it's the propellant that could be characteristically reactive. Most aerosol cans, regardless of its contents, can never be completely empty of propellant. So no matter what other chemical you have in there, it's the propellant that is the reactive part of that.
Gotcha.
So many people have these specific puncture units that help to puncture so you can release the propellant.
Make it a non-haz.
And make the actual container empty and non-haz and no longer containing the propellant, which definitely is the less expensive route to go for handling aerosol cans.
And now the biggie.
The biggie. Top solid waste. I've done all my process knowledge to determine all these things. It's not listed. It's not characteristic of the ICR, ignitability, corrosivity, and reactivity. But does it contain any potential toxicity characteristics? Well, the D004, D043, it lists, the list actually contains, I'm sorry, let me describe this a little better. The toxicity characteristic is determined by the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure. TCLP.
TCLP, okay.
A lot of people refer to it as TCLP.
Gotcha.
What that is a test in the lab that assimilates what would happen in any landfill if that material was brought to the landfill, that it leaches out through rain, storm. Even if it's solid, it leaches out potential contaminants from its source. And it contains constituents equal to or greater than the following table, which is found under 261.24, but this is the table, and you can use this as your resource, or you can look it up, but they've got regulatory limits for each one of them.
And we're not going to go through all this,
Nope.
because it'll drive you crazy.
Too much?
But please, look this up, keep this by your desk or wherever, because when, for example, you ask us, hey, what do I need to run for? We say TCLP Metals, you've got the information right there.
That's right. And you can see each level is very, very different. And really the toxicity of a heavy metal, for example, arsenic versus lead, or benzene. Oh, we've talked about benzene, right? Well, that's D018. And the level is very, very low that you have to pass, 0.5 milligrams per liter. The reason for that unit measurement of milligrams per liter, it's measuring the liquid that leaches out from the waste. Yeah. But it includes basically 6 pesticides. So if you don't have a pesticide, well, process knowledge, I don't have to worry about it. If I don't have any reason to believe I have metals, don't have to worry about those either. Or some of the 26 solvents and other organic compounds. But you can look at those and see if you actually have the potential for it. If you do, then you would need to analyze for it.
A lot of people ask and say, hey, I got aluminum, I got iron. Not on the list, you ain't got to worry about it.
It's not a heavy metal. It may be a potential industrial contaminant under cleanup standards, but it doesn't satisfy this definition.
It's a hazardous waste. Gotcha.
One important thing about TCLP, everyone thinks, oh my gosh, I have got to run TCLP analysis. It's going to cost me $2,500 for a full TCLP. Well, no, step by step.
Okay.
Whatever you have, whether it's a solid or liquid, one thing is you never have to run TCLP analysis on a liquid.
Because you don't have to leach.
You don't leach anything. The liquid, it's 100%.
Gotcha.
So really, you would only have to analyze it for the contaminant of concern and run it for totals.
Okay.
It costs maybe $10, $20, you know, depending on the lab, where you send it or whatever. But this is a step-by-step approach. But for solid, you do a total waste analysis. And you first determine what your potential contaminant is. Say you want to test for cadmium, chromium, and lead. Total waste analysis, those heavy metals. It's only the total amount that would leach out. So the total waste, let me see if I can explain this, the total waste result itself, if you divide it by 20 and it's less than that regulatory limit, then it's not a hazardous waste.
Yeah.
Only the total amount of constituent in a non-aqueous waste is present at a level less than 20 times the TCLP regulatory limit. Don't want to really get into it too much, but yes, you do need to, when you have the test, you do need to do moisture content, because you'll have to say if it's 10% liquid, you're going to have to use that number as its own total number of the liquid percent, multiply it out, then add it to an example here. The rule of 20. A non-aqueous is shown to contain less than 100 parts per million or milligrams per kilogram. Those are the units for solid materials. Okay, here we got arsenic. Its result reported at 84 milligrams per kilogram.
Less than 100, so...
If you divide 20, and let's not talk about the moisture or anything, but just say it's all 99% solid. 84 divided by 20 is what? 4.2 milligrams per liter. That is the theoretical calculation before you even test. Before you have to go through TCLP analysis. So it is below the regulatory limit, therefore it is not toxic for arsenic.
Got it.
It's a way to save money for you.
Yes, it does not have to go to a hazardous waste landfill. It could possibly go to a disposal landfill that's accepts industrial waste or whatever is non-hazardous.
Or a plug could go to Clark Environmental.
Correct, for treatment. But you cannot always rely on the chemical composition data in your safety data sheets, by the way. I know that's scary because that's hazard communication alone for determining whether a waste exhibits the toxicity characteristic. OSHA regulations only require manufacturers to identify constituents present in the material at concentrations greater than 1% or equal to. That technical data sheet may give you additional information to make a better decision. That's for non-carcinogens and then 0.1% for carcinogens. The bottom line is waste may contain toxicity constituents, potential contaminants, above regulatory levels, even though they are not identified on your STS.
Got it.
So you need to be careful. There's a lot of hidden things, and determinations by people that are specialized in doing that can help you make those determinations and walk you through it. And of course, the generator can provide valuable information for anyone assisting them.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the last slide.
Well, it's just my contact information.
Now, let me say, this is probably the most important of everything.
No.
Right now, Karen has gone through an awful lot. There's an awful lot to know. Best thing you can do is know references. And Karen's giving you a lot of references. From CFR 49, CFR 40, where to go, what to do, and all that. If you ever have any questions at all, take this information down. This young lady can get you out of trouble, answer questions, get you out of problems, do whatever you need to do. Am I a hazardous waste generator? Am I not? Whatever you need to do. I want to thank Karen from the bottom of my heart for coming here and going over this. This is a lot to do. And I am going to say without a doubt, seriously, if you have questions, take this information down because it's very important, okay? If you have any other questions and you want to know what we're wearing and how to go, CEI at Clark.environmental, ENV.com. Send them here to us. Next month, we'll go ahead and we'll pull and answer. Hopefully, I'll call Karen. Hey, I got this question here. What do I do? We'll answer your questions. If you have topics or whatever, we'll cover those. And anybody, we're going to put them all in a hat. We pull a name out afterwards, you will be eligible for a $100 gift certificate. I know it's a lot. Please, once again, take that information down. Karen, from the bottom of my heart, thank you again. I greatly appreciate it.
And stay safe. And thing about it too is very often you could actually sell your all-spec product. So there's a lot of waste exchanges out there. Try to eliminate sustainable. Find anything else, but to have a hazardous waste and expenses.
Don't go cradle to grave if you can recycle. And with that, we will see you next month on a new episode. Thank you very much.